to use speaker view. That might work out better. I'm not quite sure on your end, but I'm gonna show you some slides. And I'm going to start by, let's see if I can open that a little bit better there. I'm going to start by doing something a little bit chutzpahdik in terms of somebody who's giving, an academic and giving a public lecture. I'm going to show you some family photos. So this first one is of my great-grandmother. And if you look really carefully, if you look at her hairline, you can see that she's wearing a wig. A sheitel is the Yiddish term. It's the wig that a married Jewish woman who was observant would have worn at the turn of the century, and that would continue to wear. Observant married Jewish women will continue to wear it down until today. And in this photo, I've always thought that she looked super, kind of old-fashioned. I know it was taken in the first decade of the 20th century. And a former student of mine told me that the dress that she's wearing went out of style in the 1870s. So that just confirmed how old-fashioned she was. In this photo, you see her daughter, my grandmother. She's about 14, and I love to think of her as very she. She has bows on her shoes. She's got a bow in her hair. And I also happen to know that the dress that she's wearing was only in style between 1903 and 1910. So she was very au courant. It was called a lingerie or a linen dress. In this family photo, the woman with her back to us, in a park on a warm spring day in the early 1950s, that's my mother. And if you look over her shoulder, you can see a baby's bonnet peeking out, and that's me. So what my mother's wearing is she's wearing a white blouse and a black pencil skirt, very different than what her grandmother was wearing when she was young. And I didn't bring a photo of me because you can see me on the screen, and I'm wearing, honestly, I'm probably wearing the same jacket I wore when I visited the Midrash JCC last time, but I'm always wearing a black jacket because that's sort of my uniform as a professor. But I'm going to show you a photo of my daughter, and I love this image. First of all, she looks like a college student. She's got on a short skirt. She's wearing tall boots. When she said, "Mom, you can use this in your talk," she said, "but you have to tell them that the boots are yours," which of course I completely forgot. And she's taking a selfie with a photo. And I want to come back to that technology in that photo in a minute. But the question is, what am I doing opening this book by talking about these family photos? And the photos aren't in the book, but I do talk about them. As the clothing of the women in my family changed over time, so had their lives. And that's what drew me into this story. I wanted to know what was different about how they raised their families. What was different about the work they did, the kind of work that they were prohibited from doing. What was different about what they cooked in their kitchens. I wanted to know what was different about their politics. We're in a very, public political moment. I wanted to know a lot about their politics. I wanted to know what was different about the games that they played. When did Mahjong become a Jewish woman's game? And I can tell you it was the 1920s. And I wanted to know how had technology affected their lives. So think back to that photo of my daughter with this, taking a selfie with a phone. Here's a different era where technology has a different kind of impact. I don't know if you can tell what this woman is doing in this photo, but she's doing laundry. She's in a tenement in the second decade of the 20th century. And I want you to think about what it meant to do laundry before electric washing machines were invented. So for example, she has to fill that heavy pot with water. Now she's really lucky. She's got taps on over the sink, so she could probably fill it over there. She has to then dump the clothes in. She's got to wash them. She's got to boil the water. She's got to wash them. She's got to wait till it's cool enough to take them out. She's got to wring them out. She's got to haul the laundry, the wet, dripping laundry up to the roof, hang it out to dry, hope it doesn't rain, then bring it down, and then if it needed ironing, it had to be ironed. I don't know about you, but the notion of doing laundry was absolutely daunting before electric washing machines came in, and they're not invented until the beginning of the 20th century. So get a sense of how difficult her life would have been. But most of all, what I wanted to know in this book was I wanted to know what it meant to these women to be Jewish women, because the women in my family story are Jewish women. And I see Jewish women in three different kind of categories. There's a group of Jewish women for whom Judaism sits at the core of their lives. It determines who they married, how they move from Sabbath to Sabbath, from holiday to holiday, the community that they live in, what's cooked in their kitchens, the dishes that they buy. I mean, everything about their lives is wrapped up in this definition of Judaism. But there's a huge swath of America's Jewish women for whom being Jewish is very important. I call it Jewishness. Jewishness determined how much education they got, public school education I'm talking about. It determined who they married. It determined the neighborhoods they lived in. It determined the kinds of jobs that they held. And it was a powerful factor in their lives, but somewhat different than for the women who moved from Sabbath to Sabbath. Then there's a third category of Jewish women that I write about for whom being Jewish was not very important, inconsequential. They didn't pay much attention to it. But every once in a while, as we will see, they bumped up against people who did pay attention to it. So all of these are in my story. And as this sampler says, if you think you can be a little bit Jewish, you think you can be a little bit pregnant. So two Jewish women are going to take us into this story. The first is Grace Nathan. You've probably never heard of her. You can see her dates, 1752 to 1831. If you know your American history, you know that she lived through the Revolutionary War, the Declaration of Independence, the creation of the Constitution, its amendments in the Bill of Rights, the War of 1812. What does she write about in her letters that she left behind in an archive? She writes about a niece who has been spitting up blood for several weeks because her corsets are too tight. Clothing matters. Now this woman, maybe some of you will recognize her, but maybe more of you will know her name, Emma Lazarus. Emma Lazarus, of course, is quite famous, but what for me she's most famous as is she was Grace Nathan's great-granddaughter. So here we have a very different woman. She lived, unfortunately, a short life. She died of cancer when she was too young. But her words in the poem, The New Colossus, in the base of the Statue of Liberty, have been welcoming the huddled masses yearning to breathe free to these golden shores of America for more than a century. What is stunning about both of them is that their lives were constrained by the fact that they were women of a certain social class and that they lived as Jews in the American experiment. And so it determined what they could do and what they couldn't do, and what they thought and what they were supposed to think. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Both of them celebrated America's freedoms. Emma Lazarus wrote a poem in which she imagined her ancestors who had been expelled from Spain, trudging out of Spain, and then coming to this wonderful land that gave her people the freedom to follow Moses's law. And then she says, and to think the thoughts Spinoza taught. That's astonishing because Spinoza was a 17th century Dutch Jewish philosopher who was kicked out of the Jewish community for those thoughts. As a woman, as an American, she was making a claim as a Jew that made her a maverick in her day and time. The more surprising thing is that Grace Nathan did the same thing. She also celebrated the freedoms of America. And America's freedom gave her the gumption to try to change Jewish tradition. At the end of her life, she wrote an ethical will to her only son, and she told him there, at my death, only keep your beard for 7 days. What she was saying was, when I die, do not follow Jewish custom that says that a son does not shave for a minimum of 30 days, if not an entire year, following the death of a parent. And so she was saying only don't shave for 7 days. So here too, a traditional Jewish wife and mother and grandmother who worried about her niece who was spitting up blood, she too was changing Jewish law. And it is that impetus to be leaders in the Jewish world and to put their own imprint on what it means to be an American Jew that takes us into this story. So we go to the colonial period. We actually go to before Grace Nathan's day, when this woman, Abigail Levy Franks, was 7 years old, and then she was Abigail Levy. She came to America from England. When she was 16, she married Jacob, who you could see right here. And Jacob was 24 years old. Today, in most states, a marriage between a 16-year-old and a 24-year-old would be illegal, but not in colonial days, because Jacob had to be well enough off to support his wife and the children who would soon follow. And Abigail had 9 children. 7 of them lived to maturity. By the way, that's not the record for a colonial Jewish woman. The record belongs to Rebecca Machado Phillips, who had 21 children. She had so many children that she almost ran out of names of the Bible to give them. And we know about Abigail because her eldest son went to England when he was about 18. And as far as we know, she never saw him again. But she wrote him these amazing letters that he saved and that eventually made their way to the archive. And in those letters, we see a mother yearning for her son, but also trying to guide him as he makes his way on the other side of the Atlantic. So one of the things that she tells him is she wants him never to eat anything except for bread and butter at his uncle's house, because she doesn't trust the kashrut of her sister-in-law. She complains about the women in the synagogue. There's only one synagogue in New York, but she says they are a stupid set. And we also see her yearning for change in Judaism. She writes, and I quote, "If a Calvin or a Luther would rise amongst us, I would be the first of their followers." Imagine a colonial Jewish wife and mother wants a reformer like John Calvin and Martin Luther to come and reform Judaism. And that is way before Reform Judaism emerges. She also learns the price of that kind of an impulse because she discovers that her daughter Phila had married a Protestant Huguenot named Oliver Delancey and had hidden the marriage from her parents for 6 months. She'd stayed in her parents' home, and Abigail's spirit was crushed by this betrayal. And it's important to note, because we think of the discussion around intermarriage as being one that emerged at the end of the 20th century, but intermarriage is a major theme of the American Jewish experience going all the way back to colonial days. So I'll leave behind Abigail. I'll go past the world of Grace Nathan and the world of Emma Lazarus, and I want to turn to this woman, Rosa Sonnenschein. She came to America in the middle of the 19th century, in the 1860s, and she came with her husband, Rabbi Solomon Sonnenschein, and they settled in St. Louis, where he became a rabbi, a reform rabbi of a leading synagogue. And as a rabbi's wife, she did the things rabbis' wives were supposed to do. She had the 4th of her 4 children, so family size is getting smaller in St. Louis. She's active in the synagogue on behalf of her husband, and she does something that I love that is so amazing. I heard about your book group here. In 1879, she founded the Pioneers, what we think is the first Jewish women's book club in America. And what is utterly amazing is it is still going strong today. So that's quite a legacy. But she was a maverick in another way, because in 1892, she walked out on her husband. Now, if you know anything about divorce law, if I've got any lawyers on here, you may remember that in the 19th century, and actually up until 1964 in New York, if you wanted to get divorced, you needed grounds. By walking out on her husband, abandoning him, she gave him grounds to divorce her. Now she's got to earn a living, so what does she do? She opens the first English language Jewish women's magazine and calls it The American Jewess. What is stunning about The American Jewess is, first of all, the use of the word Jewess, because today we tend to think of that word in kind of a sardonic way. It's not a term that we hear so much any longer, and if we do, it's often used in a humorous fashion. I remember, maybe some of you remember a skit that the Saturday Night Live comedian Gerda Lerner did. It was called Jewess Jeans. But the Jewess was the term that Jewish women and men and Gentile women and men used to refer to Jewish women in the 19th century and actually down until about 1940. And the magazine tells us so much about the world in which she is. So on the one hand, she's writing about women who are wives and mothers, so there's tips on cooking and, how to be a good wife and how to take care of your children. But on the other hand, she is writing about the transformations underway at the end of the 19th century. Among them, the founding of the first of the great powerhouse Jewish women's organizations, the National Council of Jewish Women. It was founded in 1893. I was once on a panel with a bunch of men. I was the only woman on the panel. And I said something to one of them about Jewish women's organizations, and he turned to me and he said, that's just social. And I got livid. He may have thought they were just social. But if you look at these women massed in 1926 at the White House, they had social activities, but they were there because they were fighting against white slavery. This becomes the major cause of the National Council of Jewish Women. White slavery were international rings that captured young girls and women traveling on their own in the 1890s and 1900s, who were on the road. It's a period of tremendous migration. And they would lure them into false marriages, or they would kidnap them. And they sent them to brothels in Buenos Aires and Istanbul. So these organizations are so important. And of course, they're legacy organizations. They're still around today. The other one, Hadassah, founded in 1912, 1913. It sends these two nurses, Rachel Landy and Rose Kaplan, to Jerusalem. You can see the sign that they hang out in Hebrew and in English. They see 5,000 patients in their first year. So one of the things I was curious about was, why did these powerhouse Jewish women's organizations emerge now? And it has to do with the fact that there are major changes in American women's lives. In 1800, the average white woman in America, and I'm not saying all Jewish women were white, but that's the comparison group, the average white woman in America in 1800 had 7 children. By 1900, she's giving birth to 3.5. I don't know what to do with the 0.5, but we could talk about that. In 1850, life expectancy for a white woman in the United States was less than 40 years. By 1920, it had spread to 57 years. So what we have is women having fewer children, spending fewer years in childbearing and child rearing, living longer, and they use these powerhouse organizations to give back to their Jewish communities. But they didn't only need powerhouse organizations to be activists. In 1902, when the price of kosher meat soared on the Lower East Side from 12 cents a pound to 18 cents a pound, Jewish women who were immigrants, who were poor, who couldn't make ends meet paying that price for meat, they struck. They broke into butcher shops. You can see one of the signs here. It says, it's a little hidden, but it says Basar Kasher, kosher butcher. They broke into butcher shops. They smashed the windows. They took the meat out. They threw it in the street. They doused it with kerosene, and sometimes they set it aflame. And when they got arrested, what did one of them say to the judge? "We're not rioting, only see how thin our children are. But Jewish women were also rising politically to meet the challenges of their moment in time. We are in the midst of an unimaginable pandemic, the likes of which none of us have ever seen. But in 1918, when the Spanish influenza hit New York City, a Jewish nurse named Lillian Wald was put in charge of the Nurses Emergency Task Force because she had gained such a reputation already for nursing and for organizing the Henry Street settlement. At the same time, Jewish women had been involved in these same years in the suffrage movement. Yesterday, as Jerry said, yesterday marked the 100th anniversary when Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, giving women to vote. You probably don't know this. It came down to one vote. That was the only state left, and it was one vote. A young man named Harry Burns had gotten a letter that morning from his mother saying, "Be a good boy and vote for suffrage." His district wasn't in favor of suffrage, and he was a good boy. He listened to his mother, and he voted for suffrage. But the suffrage amendment was won on the backs of hundreds of thousands of women, like Sophia Lobinger, who we see here. Imagine the courage it took to climb a ladder, and you can't see it in this photo, but she has a sash on saying suffragette, and to speak to all those men. Women faced, they write about ink pots being thrown at them, bananas being thrown at them, rotten tomatoes, people shouting, "Go home, go do the dishes." It took 3/4 of a century for women to win the vote, and Jewish women are part of that story too. But there is another way where Jewish women stood up who were not always so prominently identified as Jewish women. Maybe some of you remember Edna Ferber, from the author of Showboat, Giant. She won the Pulitzer Prize. Edna Ferber was at a soiree that had been gathered by an industrialist in the woods of Michigan, and everybody that he had invited for this evening of, conversation and intellect, they all had to stay over because it was so far out of the city. And she's at dinner. It's the early 1930s, and Hitler had just come to power. And the host starts talking about money-grubbing Jews. And she watches as everyone around the table starts agreeing with the host. And she turns to her dinner companions and says, "I am a Jew." And she said she never saw such hatred on the faces of people that she was that close to. That night, when she went to her room, not only did she lock her door, she put a chair against it. So it just shows you how Jewish women could be activists against anti-Semitism in a much earlier moment, as they remain activists against anti-Semitism today. But I'm interested not only in Jewish women's activism, because I'm interested not only in famous women in this story. So here's a story about what's going on in the home in these same years. This is one of my all-time favorite books. If your book group hasn't read it, they should definitely read it. It's called Bronx Primitive by Kate Simon. It was written in the 80s. She was a travel writer, and she wrote 3 evocative memoirs of what it was like to be an immigrant coming to America and then growing up in the Bronx in the 1920s and the 1930s. In this book, she tells us a story about her mother, who every Friday would make gefilte fish and polish the furniture with lemon oil. And then, as the Sabbath descended, she would cover her head, she would light the candles, and she would begin to bless them as a pious Jewish woman should. One Sabbath, to the astonishment of her family, she blew out the candles, ripped off the headcloth, and announced, "No more, never again. I don't have to do it. I don't believe in it, and my mother's not here to make me." And according to Kate Simon, her mother never lit Sabbath candles again, but the house still smelled of lemon oil and gefilte fish, signs that Friday evening was coming. And it's a connection to Grace Nathan, who was changing Jewish tradition. In America, Jewish women have changed Jewish tradition, but it still persists. So when I get to after World War II, my story just kind of rushes forward. So if we could hear all of you, I would ask you who these people were, but I'll have to tell you because, you'll see the slides. So some of you will remember Bess Meyerson, the first and only Jewish Miss America. She was crowned in 1945. What you may not know is that after she became Miss America, most of the sponsors of the Miss America tour that she would have had in her first year pulled out because she was a Jewish woman and they didn't want to be connected with Jews. She ended up actually speaking for the Anti-Defamation League during that year. Another name in the headlines in the 40s and 50s and early 60s, Dr. Joyce Brothers. This is a great story. You may remember her as a famous television psychologist, but before she was a television psychologist, she won $128,000 as a boxing expert on a television show called The $64,000 Question. What happened? She was unusual. She'd gotten a PhD in psychology, but it's the 50s. She wants to stay home and with her daughter, but her husband's a resident, a medical resident. They can't make it on one salary. So either he says to her or she says to him, why don't you memorize a boxing manual? And actually she memorizes a boxing encyclopedia and go on this TV show. And she does, and then goes on to an amazing career. Here's another woman from the 50s. Barbie was invented by a Jewish woman named Ruth Handler. By the way, Ruth Handler had 2 children. You won't be surprised to learn their names were Barbara and Ken. Also going on in these years, Carole King and Jerry Goffin wrote a song called Will You Love Me Tomorrow. It was being sung on the radio in 1960. We see them on their wedding day. Why are they getting married? She's pregnant. What are women's options in the 1950s, 1960s if you found yourself in the family way? You could go away. Catholic women often did this, have the baby and give the baby up for adoption, but Jewish women also did that. You could try to get an abortion, very dangerous, not only for the woman, but also for the abortionists who were being put in jail at that time. Or you could marry the father of the baby or somebody else. So they got married. And finally in these years, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique being published in 1963. Why do I put these women together? Their names are in the news and they belie this image of the 1950s, the mothers of the baby boom pushing the baby boomers into the future. So this is a different era. There's a great deal of complexity to Jewish women's lives beyond the few that I just showed you. First of all, in the 1940s and 50s, we have Holocaust survivors in America. Luba Bott had come to America because her uncle, Sidney Hillman, who was a very important labor leader, had met her in Paris after the war. Before the war, she had been a nurse, but in America, she couldn't be a nurse because she didn't have any documentation. Astonishingly, her diploma survived, actually the destruction of Warsaw, and she comes to America and she learns English, passes the licensing exam, and becomes a nurse. But 2 weeks after she got here, one of her aunts said to her, tell me everything that happened and then never speak of it again. So Luba Bott told her how she had survived in the Lodz ghetto, how she had been caught in a bunker after its destruction, how she refused to say that she was Jewish. She was whipped by the Gestapo. They sent her to Auschwitz anyway, but as a Polish political prisoner, and how she managed to survive and then come to the United States. She was one of tens of thousands of Holocaust survivors who came to America and began to change America's Jewish women. In these years, these were the years when Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were executed in 1953 for spying for the Soviets. Their executions essentially crushed what had been the leftist politics of many of America's Jewish men and women that would not reemerge until we get to the new left in the 1960s. And surprisingly, these were also the years when LGBT rabble-rouser Jerry Fayer left her husband and her kids and went to hang out in the subterranean lesbian clubs of Greenwich Village. And that's before, long before Stonewall. So when I think of the transition, the moment of transition to the 60s, on the one hand, I think of this. Maybe some of you remember eating these. TV dinners, frozen TV dinners are invented in the 1950s. They're going to change women's lives. I don't know if they changed them so much, but I do remember eating them. When I think of the 60s, these are the images I think of, right? Vietnam, the Beatles, the Kennedy assassination, Martin Luther King, Woodstock, Mao Zedong, Stonewall, the moon landing. But what do I think of when I think of women in the 60s? This is what I think of. The American women's movement on the march. And it is stunning. It's actually just impossible to explain why Jewish women were so much in the forefront of the rise of American feminism. They were in the leadership of American feminism. If you watched Mrs. America recently, you would have realized it, although it's not talked about. But on Mrs. America, the show that was about the Equal Rights Amendment, Gloria Steinem identifies as Jewish. Bella Abzug, Betty Friedan, so many Jewish women were out there in the forefront. So I want to tell you the story of just two in the time that we have. The first was a refugee from Nazi Germany who came to the United States, got a law degree, and then went looking for a job. You know what happened to women who had law degrees in the 1950s and 1960s? They were told they could be legal secretaries. So after refusing a lot of interviews where that was going to be her fate, this woman, Sonia Pressman, ended up working for the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission. That had been established to enforce Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination in employment based not only on race, but also on sex. So Pressman gets there, and the cases are pouring in, the discrimination complaints. 2/3 are about racial discrimination. 1/3 are about sex discrimination. But the lawyers above her who are taking the cases, deciding which ones they're going to deal with, are only taking complaints about racial discrimination. So she turned to Betty Friedan and she said, American women need a civil rights organization. And they founded the National Organization for Women. 12% of its founding members were Jewish women at a time when Jews made up about 3% of the population of the United States. Another Jewish woman, also a refugee, this one from Vienna, came to America. Her name was Gerda Lerner. In the 1960s, she's already like in her 40s, she goes to Columbia University and gets a PhD in history and writes one of the first dissertations on American women. And she becomes essentially the founding mother of the study of American women's history. And in 1972, she begins petitioning her adopted country to create a Women's History Week. Now, March is Women's History Month. So two Jewish women leading the march forward for women's rights in their own particular spheres. This is what the Jewish world used to look like, right? I bet you've seen some of these photos in synagogues all across America. Every time I speak in a synagogue, I love to look at these photos. The rabbi surrounded by the women in their robes of his confirmation class. By the way, the woman to the left of the rabbi, the immediate left of the rabbi, that's Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Back then she was Ruth Bader. I like to say here she is at her confirmation in 1946, not at her confirmation hearings. The Jewish world changed dramatically as a result of American feminism. This is what it looks like in some places today. And I don't have time, maybe if you want to ask in the Q&A, I don't have time to go over all of those changes. But I wanted in just, let's see, maybe in just closing, I think kind of stop there. I'm going to stop there and come back so you could see me. I wanted to kind of recap a little bit and then tell you one more story. So look how far we've come in like 40 minutes, right? We went from colonial times all the way almost up to the very present. We looked at Jewish women for whom Judaism sat at the core of their lives, like Abigail Levy Franks, like Grace Nathan. They moved from Sabbath to Sabbath. We looked at Jewish women like those nurses at Hadassah for whom Jewishness was very powerful, but not necessarily Judaism. And we looked at women like Edna Ferber, for whom being a Jew was so inconsequential that this anti-Semitic industrialist invites her to his house. He had no idea. We've looked at the extraordinary changes that have happened and the way so many Jewish women were mavericks. So now I want to tell you one more story that'll bring us up to the present. Do you remember in the 1980s, during the height of the movement to free Soviet Jews, that in synagogues for their bar and bat mitzvahs, boys and girls would be twinned with a Jew in the Soviet Union? Yeah, I see a couple of nods, right? So I found a letter written by a teenager in North Miami Beach in 1982, and she wrote to her Soviet Jewish twin. And she said, did you get the letters that I sent you and the stationery that I sent you? Because she liked to collect stationery. So I did what any good historian finding a letter like that would do. I decided I was going to go find the twin. So where did I go? I went to Facebook, of course. And on Facebook, I found her twin. Her name's Kira Vovolsky. She lives in Jerusalem. She became a web designer. She did get out of the Soviet Union. And I said, are you and your twin, the person who sent this letter, did you ever like get those letters? Do you remember? And she said, no, I don't remember ever hearing from her. So I said, well, are you guys by any chance Facebook friends? And she said, no, that she and her twin, whose name is Sheryl Sandberg, COO of Facebook, are not Facebook friends. But Volvolsky's mother and Sandberg's father are. And I love to end there because it's with a pair of letter writers and then Facebook, and that's going to be the sources for the future and the future of this story. So they bring us all the way up to the present and in terms of activists, and also take us into the kind of the technology age. So thanks so much. Do we have questions? And I can look at the chat.
Yeah, I don't think there's any questions in the chat right now. So how about if everybody who would like to ask a question just unmutes yourself.
Carol?
And,
Carol Richmond raised her hand. Are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes.
Okay, hi.
Now I am. Hi, I'm holding your book. I started a class about remarkable Jewish women, and you did a wonderful job of summary, in 40 minutes. I'm having trouble figuring out whether a chronological approach to this would sit best with us, or whether looking at professions or looking at levels of Judaism, or if you have any guidance, I would love to hear it.
Are you looking only at American Jewish women, or are you looking at Jewish women around the globe?
I started out with biblical women and went through some of that, and it's been very interesting, but for all kinds of reasons, that's not going to sustain us. And people are very much interested in exactly what your book is talking about. So I can use your book, but I just wondered, how, as a professor, how do we cohese all of this fabulous information?
I tend to go chronological. It makes sense to people. Within chronology, I tend to be thematic. So for example, if you look at I was telling Jerry before, I just did a webinar for Moment magazine on the suffrage, the 100 years of suffrage. Okay. And I went back and I looked at the section on suffrage in the book, and there, it's in a chronological chapter, but it's a theme that works. So I might ask the group in the class, are there particular themes they're interested in? And then maybe you can go chronologically. And also what you should know is that this book was originally twice as long, like the original manuscript. There's so much that got left out. So you can find a lot of really good information at the Jewish Women's Archive website. Yeah. And that would help you, once you're thematic, that would help you fill in more examples.
One other comment, I just find this to be so empowering for us as Jewish women, that it's something that we haven't utilized enough to help us understand our place on the planet and how important we are. So it's wonderful. Thank you for the book.
Thank you so much. It's not just empowering for Jewish women, it's empowering for women to know their history. It's why I use the example of Gerda Lerner. If you don't know your history, you have no shoulders to stand on. An earlier book that I wrote a book called Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination. And that book is about a century-long debate starting in 1889, where women are saying, can women be rabbis? And they say it again in 1919, and they say it again in 1956. It doesn't happen in the US until 1972. But because they didn't know the history, each time they raise it, they have to invent the reasons all over again. Yeah. History is really important. It doesn't get repeated, but it is really important for understanding the present.
Thank you.
Right. Other questions or comments?
Well, I have two thoughts. One is, you told me about some really interesting talks you've been doing at AJU and other places. I wonder if you would like to share a little bit about that. And the other one is, recently women have becoming more and more prominent in our government. And I wondered if you wanted to talk about that and the women's rise to influence in our government.
Right. So I have been doing, I've been doing a lot of public speaking, mostly kind of a version of my book talk. But, you know, when the pandemic rose, then I ended up giving an entire lecture about Lillian Wald. And the other subject that I've been speaking a lot about is anti-Semitism, the history of American anti-Semitism, because I think it's the same issue, which is that we're in a moment where anti-Semitism has surged. We have no memory of how anti-Semitism had emerged in America and surged in other periods. So I actually have a public lecture that I'm going to give one for the Smithsonian next month on the history of American anti-Semitism, and I've given that before. But I'm so glad you asked about women rising, because you and I were talking before. I published a piece just last week they called it something like VP candidate Kamala Harris stands on the shoulders of many women, especially Bella Abzuk. And I don't know how many of you remember who Bella Abzuk was. She was a congresswoman from New York. She was in Congress from 1971 to 1977. And she was a firebrand. And she was a woman for our moment in time. She was advocating for clean water before there was a green movement. She introduced in 1974 the first bill for LGBT rights introduced into Congress. She was anti-war. This was the height of the Vietnam movement when in May of 1972, I have to double check the year, but the war had escalated, and there was a dragnet in Washington, D.C., and they rounded up thousands of demonstrators and put them in a sports stadium called the RFK Stadium. And she boarded a helicopter that was a traffic helicopter used for one of the radio stations, and went out to see how the United States government had turned a sports stadium into what she called a concentration camp. She called for Nixon's impeachment a year before the Watergate break-in. I mean, she was just amazing, an incredible maverick. And so I like to think that oh, one more thing. When she got elected to Congress, there were 15 women in Congress. She gets sworn in next to 420 men. It's just inconceivable. So one of the exciting things about the Democratic convention last night was to see how the political system has changed to bring so many more people in today, as you saw in the roll call, the many different kinds of Americans who are part of that movement. And I think it's important to know about these women who braved very great difficulty to enter office, a long time ago, and paved the way. We're still only about a quarter female in the House and the Senate.
And are there any other questions or comments? Oh, Ellen. Hi.
Yeah.
Hi, Ellen.
Yes, hi, thank you so much. This was a great presentation. So I'm really interested that you said that you have given talks on Lillian Wald. And I'm particularly interested in that because I'm a nurse, and being a Jewish nurse is not that common. Being a feminist Jewish nurse is not that common. Although I've been in nursing for a long time, and there's some really strong activists within nursing. So Lillian Wald was one of them. I mean, she's like the grandmother of public health.
Right. She created public health in America.
So I just love to hear more, and I'm definitely going to get your book. Do you have something about her in your book?
I definitely talk a little bit about her in the book. So when I did a lot of cutting, a lot of things got cut. I talk about nursing in the book because what you have to remember is that until the second wave of American feminism, even though more and more and more American women go out to work, they're actually basically confined to about 10 professions, and nursing is one of them.
Right.
So, and nursing was not a profession that was known as the Jewish profession, in part because it was associated so much with Christianity. But there were Jewish, first of all, when Jews have to create their own hospitals because men who become doctors can't get residencies, so they have to go to a Mount Sinai, for example. There are Jewish women's nursing schools as well at that moment in time. And I do talk about, so Luba Bott was a nurse, and I talk about Lillian Wald because she was such an important figure, and she was one of those women for whom her Jewishness was not particularly salient, although she got a lot of her funding for the Henry Street settlement from Jewish philanthropists. But she conceived of the idea that there should be a nurses' settlement in the immigrant community in the Lower East Side, and nurses should be available 24/7. And they were. So she was the natural leader of the Nurses Emergency Council during the pandemic. But my talk has much more about her than I managed to work into the book, because nobody gets, in 250 pages, nobody gets.
I'm sure. I was just interested, and and it's something that I am now. I'm retired and really interested in this whole intersection between a profession that's not a feminist or women's liberation profession, that's not a Jewish profession, but it has become, I don't know, it just raises a lot of interest.
There's a book, I think the author's name is Evelyn Benson. There's one book out.
Yeah, I know who
she
is.
Yeah, good question. Thanks. Nancy Salas. You have to unmute. Thanks.
Hi. So this is a tiny bit off topic, but I tuned in today, one, because I find this topic fascinating, and I wanted to hear more about you and what you had to say. And number two, my maiden name is Nadell, and I am from the DC area, and wanted to see maybe off the Zoom thing if we're related at all.
Well, I'm actually from New Jersey. Did they spell it with 2 L's?
They spelled it with 2 L. Actually, my family is from Massachusetts.
Oh. Yeah.
So maybe we can connect and see if
Yeah, we can connect, because I'll tell you, somebody else wrote me recently and we were not related, but I can also put you in touch with them.
Is that your maiden name?
No, that's my name. Yeah, I didn't change my name when I got married.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
so it's just Google me at American University. It'll come up, or Jerry can give you my email.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And it was a pleasure listening to you.
Great. Thanks.
I just want to thank you for being here. And if anybody's a member of Hadassah, this month, Hadassah has a whole, I mean, that's what the cover story is. It's Jews and suffrage, and you are quoted in there. Right. So if anybody has that magazine, be sure to check it out.
Yeah, and Hadassah we did a conversation for them about the cover story. Melissa Clapper, who wrote a book about Jewish women in suffrage, and Judith Rosenbaum from the Jewish Women's Archive, we were all together in a conversation about it. It's probably online. Yeah, thanks.
There's a question in the chat. Can you see that?
Yeah, oh, that is Vice President is, wait, let me get the whole thing. All right, will have any effect on our country's Jewish-wise. Interesting. So Ron's asked, I don't know if you can all see this, do you feel if Biden is elected our new president, that is Vice President Harris being married to a Jewish man will have any effect on our country Jewish-wise? I don't think so. You know what's really stunning about this moment? We have horrific anti-Semitism coming both from the right and from the left. Violence from the right, from white nationalists, but really also terrible anti-Semitism from many places in the progressive world. But individual Jews are warmly welcomed and received. The Pew Research Center does this story about, they do something called a temperature, where they ask how people feel about different groups in America, and Jews are always the most warmly regarded. It's like really stunning, and I think it's because of the nature of individual Jews are widely accepted. And I did see somebody respond something about Kushner, about Jared Kushner didn't change anything, least of all his father-in-law. So I don't think I'm not worried about any kind of backlash or reaction if we have, I'm not sure he'll be called, first spouse of the VP. I'm not sure what the official title is if Biden is elected.
Okay, well, last chance for any comments or questions. Why don't we all unmute ourselves and just give Professor Nadell a hearty hand for doing such a wonderful, interesting lecture.
Thank you.